Still mopping floors, my father's voice cut through the crowd like a blade dipped in mockery. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was worse. It was polite, controlled, and deliberate. In that moment, standing at my brother's luxury wedding, surrounded by chandeliers and people dripping in money, I felt every eye crawl over my skin. My father raised his champagne glass, smirking. "I'm ashamed to call you my daughter," he said. I smiled instead of crying because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't my humiliation. It was my beginning. The invitation had arrived 2 months earlier in an ivory envelope thick enough to feel arrogant. Gold lettering shimmered in the morning light. Charles Ward and Isabel Crawford. Request the honor of your presence at their wedding, Carlton Manor, Hampshire. I had stared at it for a long minute, fingers tracing the embossed edge, wondering if I was reading a cruel joke. My brother, the golden child of our father's empire, was finally getting his perfect fairy tale. And of course he wanted the family's embarrassment me to attend. I still remember that morning vividly. My small London flat smelled like fresh coffee and paint thinner. I'd been working overnight on a restoration project for a historical estate, ironic given that my own family's history had been scrubbed of me. The invitation lay beside my laptop like a challenge. My father hadn't spoken to me in over 3 years, not since I'd refused to come home and do something respectable. Back then, I'd been cleaning floors at a museum just to pay rent. "You're wasting your life," he'd said. Maybe I was. But at least it was my life. That evening, Lucian, my closest friend and partner in the heritage consultancy we'd quietly built from scratch, leaned against my kitchen counter reading the card upside down. "Carlton Manor," he muttered. "They don't rent that place to commoners." "They do," I said. "When money's loud enough." He looked at me, eyebrows arched. "You're not actually going, are you?" "Oh, I'm going," I replied. "Families like mine only learn through public lessons." Lucian smirked, British dry. "Public humiliation or private revenge? Both," I said, sipping my coffee. Preferably in that order. It wasn't about vengeance yet. It was about closure. Or at least that's what I told myself. For years, my father, Edward Ward, had rewritten our family's story, replacing truth with convenience. He was the kind of man who turned shame into sport and power into personality. When I left home at 21, I took nothing but my mother's old silver locket and the name she'd whispered once, Ashbourne, a name my father banned from our house, though he never told me why. By the time the wedding approached, rumors about the lost Ward daughter had resurfaced. Someone had posted an old photo of me online, young in overalls, paint on my cheek, holding a mop. The caption read, "From estate heiress to janitor." What went wrong? It made the rounds on social media. My brother's fiancée, Isabel, must have found it amusing. Her family was old money, the Crawfords. To her, my existence was probably a delightful tragedy, perfect gossip fodder for the brunch table. The day of the wedding arrived cloaked in English opulence. Carlton Manor shimmered like a cathedral built from vanity white stone columns, fountains shaped like angels and roses perfumed by wealth itself. I parked far from the valet line. No one needed to see my modest car among the Bentleys. As I stepped out, the wind carried laughter, champagne corks, and the faint notes of a string quartet. I adjusted the pin on my lapel, a small crest engraved with a name no one at that wedding would recognize yet, Ashbourne. Inside, everything glittered. Diamonds, sequins, smiles, all sharp enough to cut. Isabel stood near the grand staircase, radiant and polished. My father and brother flanked her, basking in their collective perfection. When my father spotted me, his grin froze. "Well," he said, walking over, glass in hand, "the help's arrived." "Always punctual," I replied calmly. Charles laughed, already tipsy. "Did you come straight from work, Ellie? I hear museums pay well for mopping marble." I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Only when you know what that marble's worth." My father chuckled, proud of his own cruelty. "Maybe tonight will inspire you to do something better with yourself. Maybe it already did," I said softly. He didn't notice the edge beneath my tone. He never did. The ceremony passed in a blur of white lace and applause. I watched from the back, invisible among glittering guests who'd never worked a day in their lives. When the vows ended and the reception began, I found a corner near the terrace overlooking manicured gardens. The laughter inside FO echoed like a familiar ghost. Lucien's voice buzzed in my earpiece. He was watching the event through the Foundation's broadcast feed. "Still sure about this?" he asked. "Completely," I whispered. "They wanted me here. Let them see me." At that moment, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about my mother, about the nights she told me stories of castles and titles before my father erased her from them, about the papers I'd found last year buried in a legal archive proving that she, Lady Amelia Ashbourne, had been the rightful heir to an old noble estate, a claim my father had later dissolved and stolen by forging her signature after her passing. The truth was sitting in my bag that night, sealed documents signed and witnessed restoring everything he'd taken. But truth, like revenge, demands timing. As the music swelled and the crowd gathered for toasts, I caught my reflection in the window, poised, calm, deliberate. I looked nothing like the girl they used to mock, the one who scrubbed museum floors while they dined in marble halls. My father's laughter rang out again, echoing across the ballroom. To my children, he declared, raising his glass, "One who built an empire and one who still cleans them." The crowd roared with laughter. I didn't flinch. I lifted my glass, two eyes locked on him, a small knowing smile playing on my lips. Because soon enough the man who mocked me for mopping floors would find himself on his knees polishing the name he'd tried to erase. And when that day came, I'd raise my glass again. Not to family, to justice. The morning after the wedding, the news had already spread. "Estranged daughter spotted at luxury wedding, family tension caught on camera," one headline read. My phone buzzed non-stop. I turned it off. Let them talk. They'd written me off years ago. I'd grown comfortable letting them define me wrong. By the time I reached my office, a renovated warehouse by the Thames, the city was already humming. Lucien was there, leaning against my desk, a cup of espresso in hand. "You're on 3 gossip blogs and 2 financial columns," he said casually. "Congratulations, you've gone viral for not flinching." "I wasn't there to flinch," I replied, setting my bag down. "I was there to remember. Remember what they took." I unlocked the drawer and pulled out a folder bound in blue leather. Inside were old letters, deeds, and photographs. My mother's handwriting danced across yellowed pages, elegant and steady. She'd signed every letter to Amelia Ashbourne Ward. The surname had always been forbidden when I was a child. My father said it belonged to a dead branch of nobility. I used to believe him, until I found the truth. Years ago, while working at the museum, I had stumbled across a private collection, portraits and artifacts from the Ashbourne family line. One of the curators mentioned a scandal, a missing heir, a disputed marriage, and a forged inheritance. My hands had trembled as I opened the catalog and found her, my mother, painted in oil, wearing the same silver locket I now wore every day. The plaque beneath read, "Lady Amelia Ashbourne, 1959 to 1996, last rightful heir to the Ashbourne estate, presumed deceased without heir." I wasn't supposed to exist in that story. My father made sure of it. Lucien flipped through the documents, now his brows knitting. "You're sure this is legitimate?" "It's more than legitimate," I said. "It's binding. My mother never relinquished her claim. The signatures Edward forged were copies, bad ones. I've had them authenticated by 2 experts. He looked up slowly. "So technically, the Ashbourne title, the estate, the fortune, it's all yours." "Not fortune," I corrected. "Justice." For a moment, silence filled the room, except for the muffled hum of the city below. Then Lucien said, "You know what happens if you go public with this? You won't just destroy Edward Ward's reputation. You'll shake half the old money circle." "Good," I said, standing. "They've been comfortable too long." That afternoon we met with a lawyer named Margaret Price, a quiet woman in her 50s with eyes that saw through everything. She'd once worked with my mother's estate before being dismissed by my father. When she saw me, she froze for half a second. "You look like her," she said softly. I smiled faintly. She'd be pleased to hear that. Margaret examined the documents in silence, tracing each signature with her fingertip. "This is remarkable," she whispered. "If what you're saying is true, you have not only claim to the Ashbourne estate but also controlling rights over several trusts your father absorbed illegally." Lucian leaned forward. "We'll need discretion." "For now," Margaret nodded. "Of course, but I must warn you, if this goes to court, it will be public." "I'm counting on that," I said. When we left her office, the London sky had turned gray, a sheet of drizzle misting the streets. Lucian held his umbrella, but I let the rain fall on my face. It felt cleansing, electric. For years I'd scrubbed marble floors, erasing the footprints of people who thought they were untouchable. Now I was ready to leave my own mark. Back at the flat, I opened my mother's last letter again. It had been sealed, with the Ashbourne crest, a swan wrapped around a sword. The ink had faded, but her words were sharp. "Eleanor, if you ever read this, it means the truth has found you. Don't chase revenge. Chase restoration. The world will try to rename you. Don't let it." I read the letter twice before tucking it back in the folder. Revenge was never my goal. Restoration was. But sometimes, to restore something broken, you have to dismantle the rot first. That night, the rain turned into a storm. I stayed awake, sketching plans literally. Maps, legal flows, asset chains, all spreading across my desk. The Ashbourne lineage had been buried under layers of fraud and deception, but the record still existed. My mother's family had owned not just an estate but also a series of historical restoration trusts across Europe, funds now conveniently absorbed by Ward Holdings. My father had stolen a legacy that wasn't his to touch. Lucian sent a message close to midnight. "Still awake always. Then listen, there's a Royal Heritage Gala in 2 weeks. Prince Frederick himself is attending. If you want the right audience to hear your truth, that's the place." I stared at the message, heart pounding. "You think he'd care about one forgotten name?" "Not one forgotten name. One stolen one," he replied. The thought lingered long after the lights went out. Prince Frederick wasn't just a symbol, he was a descendant of one of the families who'd once partnered with the Ashbournes. If he heard my name, if the title was spoken aloud again in the right company, history itself would start to shift. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I stood before the mirror, tying my hair back, my reflections steady. For the first time in years, I didn't see the girl who cleaned marble floors. I saw the woman who knew who she was. Lucian called. As I was leaving. "What are you planning timing?" I said simply. "The same thing they used to destroy her name. I'll use it to bring it back." As I stepped out into the pale London morning, the city seemed different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. The Thames shimmered beneath the rising sun, and for a fleeting moment I could almost hear my mother's voice again. "Don't let them rename you." I wouldn't. Not ever again. Because now the world was about to learn that Eleanor Ward, the janitor, the disappointment, the forgotten daughter, wasn't a ghost in their family tree. She was the root. 2 weeks later, the envelope arrived, cream parchment sealed with a royal crest embossed in gold. My name was written in deliberate looping script, Miss Eleanor Ward. The ink shimmered under morning light, elegant, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a doorway. Lucian found me standing by the window, the envelope still unopened. "You look like someone holding a detonator," he said. "In a way," I replied, sliding my thumb under the seal. The wax cracked softly, releasing the faint scent of lavender. Inside the words were short and precise. "The Royal Heritage Gala. Request your presence at Kensington Hall as a consultant for the Preservation Committee of Noble Estates. Hosted by His Royal Highness, Prince Frederick of Ainsworth." Lucian whistled low. "Consultant. Huh?" "I thought you were invisible." "I was," I said, until I stopped hiding. I spent the next days in quiet preparation, not for revenge, but for precision. The truth, after all, was a weapon best handled with grace. The world believed I was a simple heritage consultant who'd clawed her way into respectability. No one yet knew that I carried the rightful bloodline of the Ashbourne estate. The gala would change that. Kensington Hall rose from the edge of London like a cathedral of light. Its marble facade glowed under 100 chandeliers, each one reflecting a fortune. Guests poured out of sleek black cars, ladies and silk men in tailored arrogance. Cameras flashed, laughter echoed. I walked among them quietly, my gown a deep emerald that brushed the floor like whispered defiance. Around my neck hung my mother's silver locket, polished to a faint gleam. At the entrance, a tall attendant smiled professionally. "Name Miss Eleanor Ward," I said evenly. He scanned the list, nodded, and stepped aside. "Welcome to the Royal Heritage Gala." The ballroom was a dream built from power and old money. Tapestries lined the walls, their threads weaving centuries of lineage and betrayal. I spotted familiar faces, the Crawfords. Of course, Isabel's parents whispering to a viscount. My father wasn't there, but his influence floated in the air like a lingering scent of smoke. Lucian appeared beside me, impossibly composed in his dark suit. "Press is everywhere," he murmured. "Keep your expression neutral. You're here as a professional." "I am," I said. "Professionally inconvenient." A sudden hush spread through the crowd. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Prince Frederick had entered. He was taller than I expected, early 40s, sharp eyes, presence that filled the room without effort. He moved through the guests with polite disinterest until his gaze caught mine. For a moment, it lingered, an echo of something unspoken. When he reached our side, he extended his hand. "Miss Ward, I presume?" "Yes, Your Highness. I've read your proposal on heritage preservation," he said. "Remarkably thorough. You understand the burden of legacy." I met his eyes steadily. "Some of us were born into it without knowing." He smiled, faintly intrigued. "I hope you'll join me for dinner. We could discuss your ideas further." "I'd be honored." As he moved away, Lucian leaned close. "He's interested." "In the proposal?" I asked. "In you," Lucian said dryly. "And possibly in the storm you're about to cause." Dinner was a symphony of subtle politics. The table stretched the length of the hall, adorned with crystal and gold. I sat 3 seats away from the prince, surrounded by nobles who wore their names like armor. Conversation buzzed around me: inheritance disputes, art acquisitions, social climbing disguised as philanthropy. Halfway through the meal, Lord Whitmore, a man whose family once invested in my father's company, turned to me with a smirk. "Miss Ward, I hear you specialize in forgotten estates." "How fitting." I smiled sweetly. "Yes, my lord. I've learned that forgotten things often have the most inconvenient truths." A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. Frederick's gaze flicked toward me, curious, maybe impressed. After dinner, as the orchestra shifted into a slow waltz, I slipped away to the gallery adjoining the hall. Portraits of nobles lined the walls, generations frozen in oil and pride. And there at the far end, my breath caught. My mother. The portrait had been restored, her face luminous beneath soft varnish, Lady Amelia Ashbourne, 1959 to 1996. I stepped closer, fingertips trembling as I traced the frame. The plaque had been reattached recently. The curator must have uncovered the name from old records. She was back in the light. My throat felt impossibly tight. This wasn't just paint and canvas. It was a defiant resurrection. All the shame I had carried, the insults, the years of scrubbing floors, seemed to peel away under the fierce, elegant gaze of the woman in the portrait. She hadn't been erased. She had been waiting. A wave of profound grief and exhilaration hit me. Grief for the life she lost. Exhilaration for the truth now standing tall in the palace of her oppressors. A voice behind me broke the silence. "She was remarkable, wasn't she?" Frederick stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable. "You knew her?" I asked quietly. "My father did," he said. They corresponded briefly about preservation laws. He admired her courage. I swallowed hard. She was erased. "And yet here she is again," he said softly. "Some names refuse to stay buried." The air between us shifted. I turned to face him fully. Your Highness, do you believe legacy can be stolen? He considered that. No. Hidden, perhaps. Distorted. But not stolen, not forever. A good restorationist knows the true value of the object, not its market price. I stated, my eyes locking with his. You seem to possess that knowledge. He acknowledged my challenge with a slight dip of his head. I have a deep respect for foundational truth, Miss Ward, especially when it involves the architectural scaffolding of this country's history. Then maybe it's time the truth found daylight. Daylight can be a harsh judge, he cautioned, his voice low. But necessary, I believe. His gaze sharpened, but before he could answer, a voice interrupted from the doorway, Isabel Crawford, glittering in gold. Your Highness, we've been looking everywhere. She smiled at me thinly. Miss Ward, isn't it? You look unexpectedly elegant. Thank you, I said evenly. You look exactly as expected. Frederick hid a smile, turning toward Isabel as she chattered about the evening's charity auction. As he left, he glanced back once, meeting my eyes. There was a silent understanding there, one neither of us yet dared to name. When the gala ended, Lucian and I walked through the cold London night, the lights of Kensington fading behind us. You made an impression, he said. I wasn't trying to, which is why it worked. I stopped under a street lamp, the golden light catching on the locket at my throat. He mentioned her, Lucian. My mother. He knew of her. That's good, he said. The right memory in the right room. I nodded slowly. Then it's time. I'm done being erased. The rain began to fall again, gentle and insistent. I tilted my face toward it, the cool drops tracing the edges of a smile I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was chasing ghosts. It felt like they were walking beside me. The letter arrived 3 days after the gala, stamped with a royal seal and signed by Prince Frederick himself. It wasn't the kind of correspondence people like me usually received. The handwriting was clean, deliberate, and unmistakably personal. Miss Ward, if your schedule allows, I would value your insight regarding the restoration project at the Ashbourne estate. Respectfully, Frederick of Ainsworth. The words burned into me like a quiet challenge. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Lucian was already in the office when I stormed in the letter, trembling slightly in my hand. He read it once, then looked at me with a half smile. He's not subtle, is he? He's careful, I said. That's worse. Are you going? Of course. By the next morning, we were on the road to Hampshire, the sky gray and restless. The countryside rolled past like a painting came undone. I hadn't been back to the Ashbourne land since I was a child, when my mother still carried hope like a fragile candle. When we reached the gates, I stopped breathing for a moment. The wrought iron still bore the faint crest of a swan coiled around a sword, the same emblem on her locket. My locket. A guard opened the gate without question, as though he'd been told to expect us. The car wound down the gravel drive until the house appeared stone and ivy, regal, but tired. It looked like time had tried to swallow it whole, but couldn't quite manage. Frederick was waiting at the entrance, dressed simply in a gray coat, his hair damp from the mist. Miss Ward, he said warmly, thank you for coming. Your Highness, I replied. I wasn't sure the invitation was meant for me. It was, he said, eyes steady. I think this place has waited long enough for you. We toured the estate in silence. Dust clung to the air and the faint scent of lavender, my mother's perfume, still lingered in the hall. The library was the worst, books, rotted pages curling yet. A faint trace of her handwriting marked the margins. She'd once taught me to read in that room, her voice soft against the crackle of the fire. I paused at the window overlooking the gardens. She planted those roses, I said quietly. They still bloom in winter. Frederick's voice was low. You remember much. I remember enough. He watched me carefully. Your mother's story, it wasn't fair. I've seen the records how your father petitioned to absorb her holdings after her passing. My chest tightened. He called it consolidation. I call it theft. The words hung between us like something holy and dangerous. He continued, The Crown's legal office has been reviewing several old estate claims. The Ashbourne case resurfaced last year, but without a living heir, it was archived again. I touched the silver locket beneath my coat. There is a living heir, I said, my voice a quiet statement, not a question. Lady Amelia Ashbourne left me. His eyes softened. I know. Lucian, who had been pretending to check restoration notes nearby, gave me the smallest nod. He knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Frederick opened a folder he'd brought with him, revealing faded documents, deeds, and a photograph of my mother standing beside a much younger version of my father. She was brilliant, he said. She designed half of this restoration plan before it was stolen. She was more than brilliant, I said. She was right. For the first time, Frederick smiled, not as a prince, but as a man who understood. If you want, I can help reinstate her title formally through the royal registry. It won't be easy, but it can be done. Why would you do that? I asked, wary. Because injustice, Miss Ward, corrodes history. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But years of betrayal had taught me that good intentions were just masks that power wore. As we walked back toward the main hall, he paused near the grand staircase. You remind me of her, he said. Not in appearance, but in defiance. She used to say defiance was a luxury, I murmured. He smiled faintly. Then I hope you're rich in it. The tour ended in what used to be her sitting room. Dust covered the piano, but when I lifted the lid, the keys still worked. I pressed one softly. The sound echoed through the hall, lonely and alive. Frederick stood beside me, hands clasped behind his back. You know, he said quietly, there's talk that the Ward family may face scrutiny soon. Unofficially, of course. You've stirred interest where it was long dead. I met his gaze. Then maybe death doesn't mean silence. He nodded, once solemn. No, it doesn't. When he turned to leave, I called after him. Why me? He stopped. Because he said you don't want power. You want the truth. And the world listens differently to those who seek one over the other. That night I stayed behind after everyone left. The house creaked with the weight of memories. I found my way to the study, the one my father had forbidden me from entering as a child. Inside, beneath a layer of dust, sat a locked drawer. It took only one firm pull for it to give way. Inside lay a stack of letters bound in red ribbon. My mother's handwriting addressed to Frederick of Ainsworth. My breath caught. The first line read, If something happens to me, promise me you'll watch over her. I sank into the chair, the room spinning around me. He'd known all along. Not just the truth, but me. Lucian found me an hour later, the letters spread across the desk like a confession. He looked at the papers. What is it? Proof, I whispered. And protection. When we left the estate, the night air was cold enough to sting. I turned back one last time. The great windows of Ashbourne glowed softly as though someone inside had lit the lights for the first time in decades. Lucien started the car. You realize, he said, if you use this, your father's empire will crumble. I looked out at the estate disappearing in the fog. Then let it. Because some legacies aren't worth saving. Some need to burn before they can bloom again. The invitation to the Whitmore charity dinner arrived 2 weeks later, printed on heavy cardstock with edges dipped in gold. I didn't need to read the names to know who would be there. Edward Ward never missed an opportunity to feed his vanity in public. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who once called me a useless embarrassment was now hosting the very event where his empire would start to collapse. Lucian set the invitation down on my desk. He's walking straight into it, he said. I nodded. Good. It's time he saw what a real legacy looks like. The evening arrived wrapped in fog and money. The Whitmore estate stood like an ivory fortress at the edge of Surrey, lit with chandeliers so bright they turned the mist into glass. Black cars lined the circular drive, their doors opening to release men in tuxedos and women in diamonds, worth more than I'd ever earned scrubbing museum floors. I stepped out of my modest sedan, the same one my father used to mock, and handed my coat to the valet. My gown was black, sleek, minimal, almost severe. No jewels, no sparkle, just fabric that moved like shadow. Lucian waited at the entrance bow tie, undone, a wry smile tugging at his mouth. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked. "I was born ready," I said. He just forgot. Inside, the air smelled of roses and champagne, the twin perfumes of privilege. Waiters drifted through the crowd like ghosts carrying trays of caviar and conversation. I spotted my father near the grand fireplace, laughing too loudly, his hand gripping the shoulder of Lord Whitmore as though to anchor himself to power. My brother Charles stood beside him, polished as always. Edward noticed me first. The smile froze, then reassembled into something that looked like civility. "Eleanor," he said, drawing out the syllables like a dare. "Didn't expect you'd come." "I wouldn't miss it," I said evenly. "It's not every day a man gets to toast his own downfall." He chuckled, not understanding. "Still dramatic, I see. Maybe you should have gone into the theater instead of whatever it is you do now." "I restore history," I said, meeting his eyes. "Usually from people who try to bury it." Charles intervened, his tone smooth. "Let's not do this here. It's a charity event." "Yes," I said. "For the preservation of noble estates, isn't it fitting?" He blinked, uneasy. He knew what I meant. At dinner, I found myself seated directly across from my father. The table glittered with silver and crystal, the conversation buzzing around us like bees. But beneath the laughter, there was tension. Edward's empire had been in quiet trouble for months, investors pulling out rumors of legal audits. And tonight, I was the shadow behind those whispers. Halfway through the second course, Lord Whitmore stood to make a toast. "To the Ward family," he said grandly, "whose contributions to England's heritage have been unmatched." I raised my glass, smiling. "And to those who actually built that heritage and were never credited for it." A ripple of confusion moved through the guests. Edward's jaw tightened. "Eleanor," he hissed under his breath. "Not here." "Why not?" I said softly. "You erased her here. Seems poetic to resurrect her in the same place." He stared at me, confusion flickering into realization. My mother," I said. "Lady Amelia Ashbourne." The air left the room like a sucked breath. Charles dropped his fork. The other guests exchanged uneasy glances. I could feel Lucian watching from across the room, his hand tightening around his glass. Edward leaned closer, his voice low and sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," I whispered, "and so will everyone else soon enough." I slid a small envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the forged documents he'd used to absorb her estate, the original signatures authenticated and stamped. His hand trembled as he opened it. "Where did you get these?" "From the ashes," I said. "Where you left them." For a moment he was silent. Then, through clenched teeth, "You think this will make you powerful? You're playing with things you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said. "You built your life on theft. I'm here to take it back." Across the room, the orchestra faltered as whispers rippled through the crowd. Lord Whitmore frowned, unsure whether to intervene. My father's face had gone pale, beads of sweat glistening at his temple. He looked older, smaller. Then, as if to save himself, he laughed a brittle, desperate sound. "My daughter," he announced loudly, "has always had a flair for fantasy. Claims of nobility of estate, such imagination." The crowd chuckled politely, tension broken. He turned to me with that same condescending smirk I'd seen since childhood. "Maybe one day you'll learn that truth isn't something you can invent." I stood slowly, setting my napkin down. "You're right," I said. "You can't invent it. You can only hide it. Until someone decides to dig." I reached into my bag and placed one final document on the table, the reinstatement request for the Ashbourne title signed by Prince Frederick himself. The silence was absolute. My father's face was drained of color. "You spoke to him," he whispered. "He spoke to me," I corrected, "because unlike you, he knew what my mother was worth." Lucian stepped forward, then his voice calm but cutting. "Ward Holdings will be under investigation by Monday morning. Financial irregularities tied to the Ashbourne trusts." The murmurs began immediately like the rising tide of a storm. Edward's hand trembled around his glass. "You've ruined us," he said. "No," I said softly. "You ruined her. I'm just setting it straight." I turned to leave but paused at the doorway. The room behind me had erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, silver clinking against glass, the careful structure of power beginning to fracture. I didn't look back. Outside, the night air was cold sharp with the promise of rain. Lucian caught up beside me, his breath visible in the dark. "Well," he said, "that was catastrophic." "Necessary," I said. We walked in silence until we reached the car. In the distance, the estate glowed like a dying ember. Lucian opened the door for me. "You think he'll come after you?" I smiled faintly. "He'll try. But I've already taken what he values most. His company, his illusion." As we drove away, thunder rolled across the horizon. I looked back once at the fading lights of the dinner at the house where lies had finally begun to crumble. The storm had started, and for the first time I wasn't the one being washed away. By Monday morning, London was roaring with scandal. Every major business column carried the same headline, "Ward Holdings under royal audit." Beneath it, a smaller line read, "Anonymous sources suggest forgery and inheritance fraud." I didn't have to guess who the anonymous source was. Lucian tossed the paper onto my desk. "Congratulations," he said dryly. "You've officially detonated a dynasty." I stared at the photo beneath the headline, my father, Edward Ward, leaving his office, face grim reporters swarming like vultures. It's about time someone did. My office feels different now. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to pulse with new energy. For years I had lived in the margins of their world. Now I was the headline that made them choke on their breakfast. The phone buzzed. Margaret Price, my mother's old lawyer, her voice steady but tense. "Eleanor, you've opened Pandora's box. The Royal Review Board wants you to submit your mother's letters and the authentication documents formally. Are you ready for that level of exposure?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. Truth doesn't survive behind curtains. Lucian raised an eyebrow. "You really think they'll reinstate the Ashbourne title?" "They don't have a choice," I said. "The law's clear. The estate was never legally transferred." He leaned back. "You realize what this means, right? You're about to become one of the most visible women in Britain, and not everyone's going to be clapping. I'm not doing this for applause." "I know," he said softly, "but they don't." By afternoon, the storm had grown teeth. Reporters camped outside the building, flashes exploding every time the door opened. Commentators speculated endlessly, who was this forgotten daughter? Why had the royal family taken interest? Some called me an opportunist. Others called me a reformer. Only one person hadn't called at all, my father. That silence was louder than every headline. Around midnight, Lucian was still at the office when I found him staring out the window. The city glowed below, restless and bright. "He'll reach out eventually," he said. "Cornered men always do." I sank into the chair opposite him. "He doesn't want reconciliation. He wants control. And I want peace." A knock broke the quiet. Margaret entered, her coat dripping with rain. "They're escalating," she said. "Edward's attorneys are claiming your mother's letters were forged. He's filing a counterclaim." I almost laughed. "He's really going to accuse me of forgery after what he did. That's how they survive," Margaret said grimly. "They twist the truth until people forget what it looked like. Then I'll remind them." The next morning, the Royal Council summoned me to an official hearing at St. James's Palace, a closed session, strictly confidential. But nothing about this case would stay hidden for long. When I arrived, the palace corridors were eerily quiet, the walls lined with portraits of kings and queens who had all lived and died by the power of legacy. I felt their eyes on me as I walked. Prince Frederick greeted me outside the council chamber, his expression unreadable. "You understand," he said, "this won't just expose him. It will expose all of them." "I know," I replied. "That's the point." Inside the room was small, the air thick with formality. 3 members of the Royal Heritage Board sat behind a carved oak table. I presented the documents, my mother's original will, the verified handwriting samples, the proof of forged transfers. Every page carried the weight of a lifetime stolen. Frederick remained silent throughout, his gaze steady, unwavering. When I finished, he spoke at last. The Crown recognizes Lady Amelia Ashbourne's rightful lineage. Her estate by law transfers to her direct heir. He looked directly at me. That's you, Miss Ward. The decision was procedural, almost cold, but when the gavel struck, something inside me cracked open. It was done. When I stepped outside, the press was waiting. Microphones thrust forward, questions fired like bullets. Miss Ward, is it true the Crown reinstated your title? Are you planning to sue your father? Will you reclaim the Ashbourne estate? I didn't answer any of them. I simply said, justice has a long memory, and walked away. That night, the world went mad. My face appeared on every major outlet, my mother's portrait beside it. The public loved the story, the maid who became a noblewoman. They made me a symbol I never asked to be. But while the city celebrated, I sat alone in my flat, lights dimmed, the silence humming with fatigue. The phone rang again, this time an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. Eleanor, my father's voice rasped. What have you done? Corrected history, I said. You think this makes you strong? You think they respect you now? You're a novelty, something they'll chew up and spit out. Maybe, I said quietly, but at least I'll know who I am when they do. There was a long pause, then a low, bitter laugh. You always were your mother's daughter. That's the first true thing you've said. He hung up. Lucian found me hours later, still sitting in the dark. You okay? I nodded, though my hands were trembling. He called. What did he say? That I'm my mother's daughter. Lucian smiled faintly. Then I'd say we're on the right path. Outside, the city thundered with rain again. Lightning flared over the skyline, slicing the night open. I stood by the window, watching water stream down the glass like tears I refused to shed. For years, they'd taught me that silence was survival. Now I knew better. Silence had only kept me buried, and I had finally learned how to speak. The morning after the verdict, my world split cleanly in two, half applause, half silence. Newspapers called it a triumph of justice. Social media crowned me the noble lady who rose from dust. But beneath the noise, something colder stirred. The higher the praise, the sharper the knives. Lucian was the first to notice the shift. They're digging, he said, scrolling through a flood of articles. Every outlet wants a piece of your past, your jobs, your debts, your friends. They're not celebrating you, Eleanor. They're dissecting you. Let them, I said. Truth doesn't bruise easily. He set the tablet down, frowning. It does when it's human. That week was a blur of interviews, meetings, and lawyers. The Royal Council scheduled the official reinstatement ceremony for the Ashbourne name. I was to receive my mother's restored title along with her holdings and the Ashbourne estate itself. It should have felt victorious. It didn't. Every time I saw my mother's name in print, surrounded by my father's scandal, it felt like they were touching something sacred with dirty hands. The night before the ceremony, I sat alone in my apartment, the locket heavy in my palm. I hadn't slept in days. The city hummed below, alive and indifferent. Then came the knock. I opened the door to find Prince Frederick standing there, no guards, no entourage, just him, coat damp from the drizzle. Your Highness, I said, startled. This isn't exactly protocol. He smiled faintly. Neither are you. He stepped inside, glancing around the modest room. It looked nothing like the gilded halls he lived in. You've made quite the mess, he said softly. History's always messy when it's told honestly. True, he admitted. But honesty is expensive. It costs privacy, friends, peace. I never had much of those to lose. He studied me for a long moment. You remind me of your mother. She never bowed to power, but she paid for it. I know. Are you ready to pay too? I didn't answer right away. I'd imagined victory as a clean break, a moment of pure air after years underwater. But now it just felt heavy. I didn't come this far to hide again, I said finally. If truth costs me peace, so be it. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then you'll need allies. After tomorrow, your name will be gold and a target. I don't want gold, I said quietly. I just want her legacy back. Then accept the protection that comes with it, he said. Publicly. The Crown will announce your reinstatement not as a scandal, but as heritage restored. Let me stand beside you. I hesitated. As a prince, as a witness, he said. The ceremony took place in the Grand Hall of Kensington Palace under the same vaulted ceilings where monarchs had been crowned and condemned. Reporters lined the back walls, their flashes like lightning against marble. I wore a simple black suit, not a gown. No sparkle, no crown. Just the crest of Ashbourne pinned near my heart. Prince Frederick stood beside the heritage minister as the official decree was read aloud, by order of the Crown and the authority vested in the Royal Heritage Council. Lady Amelia Ashbourne's estate and lineage are hereby restored to her rightful heir, Miss Eleanor Ward, henceforth recognized as Lady Eleanor Ashbourne. The applause was polite, restrained. Cameras clicked. Somewhere I heard Lucian exhale. When they handed me the certificate, my hands didn't shake. I'd spent years earning that steadiness. Frederick turned to me, lowering his voice. You've done it. The name lives again. It never died, I said. It was just waiting to be spoken. After the ceremony, the crowd swarmed. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs burned. Through it all, my father's absence screamed louder than their noise. He hadn't shown up. Not to deny, not to defend. Silence again, his favorite weapon. Later that evening, when the palace had emptied, Frederick found me standing alone in the garden. The air was cool, the roses trembling under the weight of mist. You look exhausted, he said. I feel hollow. That's what truth does, he murmured. It doesn't fill you. It clears you. He reached into his pocket and handed me something small wrapped in cloth. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a silver thimble worn smooth with age. It belonged to your mother, he said. She gave it to my father once as a symbol. She said creation and courage use the same hands. My throat tightened. You kept this up all these years. I kept my word to her, he said, to watch over you when the time comes. And now it's come. Yes, he said softly, and it's only the beginning. When he left, I stood alone beneath the pale glow of lanterns, the thimble warm in my palm. Somewhere in the distance, a violinist played the final notes of the evening's waltz, the sound fading into the night. Lucian met me in the car. The world's already spinning, he said, checking his phone. You're trending everywhere. People are calling you the noble lady of justice. I laughed quietly. They always need a name for something they don't understand. You realize your father's cornered now, Lucian said. He'll fight back. I'm counting on it. We drove through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I looked out the window, watching the world blur by. For years, I'd fought to reclaim my mother's name, my dignity, my truth. But now, I understand justice isn't a finish line. It's a debt that keeps collecting interest. As we crossed the bridge, I caught my reflection in the window. Steady eyes, calm posture, a woman who had outlived her shame. I thought of my father's voice that night on the phone, the bitterness in it. You think they respect you now? No. They didn't have to respect me. They just had to remember my name. The Ashbourne estate looked different in daylight. For years it had lived in my memory as a place of ghosts and locked doors, a house frozen in grief. But now, as the morning sun broke through the fog, it seemed to breathe again. The gates opened automatically when I approached. For the first time in decades, the rightful heir was coming home. Lucian parked the car near the stone steps. You're sure you want to do this alone? I nodded. It's not something anyone can do with me. He hesitated, then handed me a key. They left this in the library safe. It's marked with her initials. A small brass key engraved A.A. Amelia Ashbourne. My mother's touch lived even in the metal. Inside the house smelled of dust and lavender, like the past itself had been bottled and left to ferment. Light streamed through the tall windows, scattering across portraits that had watched centuries pass. My mother's face hung among them now, newly restored, her eyes fierce and knowing. I walked through each room in silence. The grand hall, the drawing room, the music room where she had once played. Every creak in the floorboards was a whisper of memory. In the study, I found her desk, untouched ink bottle, half-full papers stacked neatly. One envelope lay apart from the rest, sealed in red wax. My name written in her looping hand, Eleanor. My heart pounded as I broke the seal. "My dearest Ellie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means the truth has found you. It means you chose to look pain in the eye and not flinch. I did not leave you strength, I left you questions. And in finding their answers, you have become what I could not free." The words blurred as tears welled. I'd spent my life chasing justice for her, but she'd wanted something far simpler, my freedom. I read on. "There will come a day when the world knows your name. Do not let it own you. Nobility is not inherited. It is chosen every time you rise when they expect you to bow." The letter ended with a date, April 4th, 2002, the same day she died. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands, until the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. "I thought I'd find you here," a familiar voice said. I turned. My father stood in the doorway. His once perfect suit hung loose on him. His eyes were red-rimmed, sleepless. For a moment, I saw not the tyrant who'd crushed my mother's legacy, but a man crumbling under the weight of his own lies. I didn't move my muscles tight with an old familiar fury. "How did you get in? This was my house once," he said quietly. "No," I corrected. "It was hers. You just lived in it." He took a step forward, his shoes echoing against the marble. "Eleanor, listen to me. I've been listening my whole life," I snapped. "To your excuses, your sermons, your silences. I'm done." He flinched. "You think I don't regret what happened? You think I wanted any of this? You did want this," I said. "Every inch of it. The power, the money, the control. You erased her because she stood between you and your reflection." He shook his head, voice breaking. "You don't understand the kind of world I was fighting in. Back then, a woman's name couldn't hold an empire. If I hadn't signed the transfers, the company would have collapsed. So you saved the company by killing the person who built it." His jaw tightened. "I loved her. Then you should have protected her." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The house seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he whispered, "She didn't want you to hate me. She didn't want me to be you." He turned toward the window, staring out at the gardens. "They're saying I'll lose everything," he said. "The board, the investors, you already lost everything," I interrupted. "You just didn't notice when it happened." He looked back at me, eyes hollow. "You think this makes you noble?" "No," I said. "It makes me whole." I stood folding my mother's letter carefully and tucking it inside my coat. "You should go, Father. There's nothing left for you here." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're stronger than she was. She made me that way." When he left, the house seemed to exhale the tension draining from its walls. I followed him outside, watching as his car disappeared down the long gravel drive. Lucian emerged from the garden, expression cautious. "You spoke to him?" "Yes." "How did it go?" "It ended," I said simply. He studied me for a moment. "Then it's over." I looked up at the house, the sun catching the stained glass windows, painting color across the stone. "Not yet. Ending something isn't the same as healing it." That evening I wandered through the estate grounds, tracing the path my mother used to walk. The air was cool, scented with earth and roses. At the edge of the property stood an old glass house, its door half open, vines curling through the cracks. Inside I found a single blooming rose bush, its petals white as frost. A brass plaque beneath it read, "Amelia's Hope." I knelt beside it, fingers brushing the petals. "You got your name back," I whispered. "But I think what you really wanted was for me to have mine." The wind rustled the leaves in response, soft and steady. Lucienne appeared at the doorway. "You're going to stay here tonight?" "Yes," I said. "I think the house needs company." He smiled faintly. "So do you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit one of the old oil lamps and set it by the window. The light flickered against the glass, casting long shadows across the roses. For the first time, the estate didn't feel like a monument to pain. It felt like a promise one I finally understood. Justice had brought me here, but love, the quiet, defiant kind my mother carried, was what would keep me. And as the night settled over Ashbourne, I realized that the ghosts had stopped whispering. They were finally at peace. The letter from the Royal Council arrived at dawn, delivered by hand, the paper thick and crested in gold. It was short, 3 lines only. Due to continued disputes over inheritance and assets, Lord Edward Ward has filed an appeal for joint control of the Ashbourne holdings. The council requires your presence for mediation at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I read it twice, my pulse steady, but cold. He wasn't done. Even after everything, he was still trying to claw back what he'd stolen. Lucian appeared at the doorway, hair tousled, coffee in hand. "You're reading bad news again, aren't you?" "Worse," I said, handing him the letter. He skimmed it and sighed. "He's insane. After what the Crown ruled, he doesn't have a leg to stand on." "Desperate men don't need legs," I said quietly. "Just an audience." By the time we reached London the next morning, the entire city seemed to be watching. Reporters lined the steps of the royal courts, shouting questions I didn't answer. Lucian stayed close behind, his expression unreadable. Inside, the hearing chamber gleamed with the weight of history oak panels, oil portraits, the faint smell of dust and judgment. Edward was already there, dressed in black, his silver hair perfectly combed. When he saw me, he smiled, a sharp, brittle thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, "how nice of you to come. I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to face me again." I took my seat across from him. "I've faced ghosts scarier than you." The council members entered, led by a woman in a gray suit with the bearing of a judge and the patience of a saint. "We're here to settle the matter of Ward versus Ashbourne," she said. "Lord Ward, Miss Ward, you both understand the stakes." Edward leaned forward, voice calm and rehearsed. "I only wish to protect what's left of our family legacy. My daughter's actions, publicizing falsehoods, dragging the family name through scandal, have harmed us all. I'm merely asking for shared oversight of the estate." I met his gaze. "You mean you want the keys back?" The judge turned to me. "Lady Ashbourne, your response?" "My father speaks of legacy," I said. "But legacies built on lies don't deserve preservation. He forged documents, exploited my mother's death, and erased her name from history. Now that the truth has surfaced, he wants control again of the very thing he destroyed." Edward's voice hardened. "Your mother's idealism would have ruined us all. You don't know what it was like to hold an empire together." "I know exactly what it's like," I said, "because I rebuilt it." The room fell silent. The judge shuffled her papers, then spoke. "Lord Ward, unless you can produce legal evidence disproving the prior authentication, your appeal holds no merit." Edward hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Actually, Your Honor, I can." Lucian stiffened beside me. A clerk entered the chamber carrying a leather folder which Edward opened with deliberate slowness. Inside were several faded letters, my mother's handwriting. He slid one across the table. These were found in an old Ashbourne vault. They appear to indicate that Amelia Ashbourne voluntarily transferred her estate rights to me before her death. I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's impossible." The judge examined the papers. "They seem genuine." "They're not," I said sharply. "My mother never—" Edward interrupted, voice dripping with feigned sorrow. "She trusted me. Even after you and your wild accusations drove her into despair, she—" The rest of his sentence disappeared in a blur of rage. I stood up so fast my chair hit the wall. "Don't you dare speak her name like that." Lucian reached for my arm, but I pulled away. "Those letters are fake, and you know it. You forged everything else. Why stop now?" Edward smirked. "You sound emotional, my dear. Not very noble behavior." The judge's voice sliced through the tension. "Order." She looked between us. "We will examine these documents further. Until verification is complete, the estate's financial access will be frozen." That word "frozen" hit like ice. As the session adjourned, Edward leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You may have the title, but you'll never have the control. You're a child playing queen. I turned to him, smiling coldly. Then I'll grow up fast. Lucian led me out of the chamber, past the cameras, past the questions. Once outside, I exhaled hard, the cold air burning my lungs. He's bluffing, Lucian said. Those letters won't hold. They don't need to, I said. They just need to stall. Long enough for him to bleed me dry in court fees and headlines. He nodded grimly. Then we fight faster. By evening, I was back at the estate, pacing the study, while Lucian and our legal team analyzed scanned copies of the letters. Look at the ink, one of the experts said. It's not from the early 2000s. It's synthetic, manufactured post-2015. I closed my eyes, relief washing over me like sunlight through storm clouds. Can we prove it? With lab testing, the expert confirmed. But it'll take days. Days. Time Edward would use to wage war in the press. And sure enough, the next morning, the headlines screamed, Lady Ashbourne's inheritance, under question, new evidence, emerges. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the story unfold on live television. Edward's voice played from the broadcast, smooth and manipulative. I only want peace. My daughter has forgotten where she came from. Lucian muted the TV. He's good at this. So am I said. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called since the ceremony, Prince Frederick's private office. His assistant answered. This is Lady Ashbourne, I said. Tell His Highness I need the royal archivist tonight. And tell him it's about Amelia. That night, under the dim light of the palace archive, Frederick watched silently as I placed the forged letters beside my mother's authenticated ones. The difference was glaring, her real writing, graceful, certain. His forgeries heavy and hollow. When I looked up, Frederick nodded. We'll have the royal lab verify it by morning. When the results come in, your father's finished. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Thank you. He studied me quietly. You're trembling. I'm angry, I said. That's all. No, he said softly. You're afraid of what happens when it's truly over. He was right. I'd built my life around the fight. I wasn't sure who I'd be without it. As I left the palace, the night air cut sharp against my skin. Somewhere behind me, the clock at Westminster struck midnight. Tomorrow would bring proof headlines and perhaps victory. But tonight, all I could feel was the weight of blood. The cost of carrying my mother's war long after she was gone. And somewhere deep inside, a quieter truth whispered, every victory demands a sacrifice. Even the ones you win. The results came just before dawn. I hadn't slept, just sat by the fire in my mother's study, staring at the clock as the hours bled away. When the phone finally buzzed, I already knew it was Lucian. They tested the ink, he said, his voice sharp with fatigue and triumph. Synthetic like we thought. Post-2015. The forgeries are confirmed. I exhaled a long, unsteady breath. And the council. They're convening an emergency hearing. Prince Frederick himself called for it. By noon, your father's case will be over. For a moment, silence filled the room, the kind that comes before storms break or after they've passed. Then I stood, folded my mother's letter, and tucked it into my coat. Then let's end this. The drive to London was long and quiet. Gray clouds hung low over the city like an omen, but I didn't feel dread, only finality. The Royal Council chamber was packed when I arrived. Journalists pressed against the barriers outside, flashes igniting like gunfire. Inside, the air was brittle with tension. Edward sat at the opposite table, surrounded by lawyers. His face was drawn but defiant. When our eyes met, something in his expression faltered, not guilt, not regret, but exhaustion. Prince Frederick presided at the head of the chamber, though his role was purely symbolic. His presence was enough to silence the crowd. The judge spoke first, voice steady as stone. We have completed the forensic analysis of the letters presented by Lord Ward. The ink paper composition and signature pattern confirmed that the documents were created within the last decade. Therefore they cannot have been written by Lady Amelia Ashbourne. Edward shifted in his seat. The judge continued, "The Crown declares these letters forgeries, and the court finds that Lord Ward knowingly submitted falsified evidence. His appeal is dismissed. The estate of Ashbourne shall remain under the sole ownership of Lady Eleanor Ashbourne." It was done. The gavel struck once final, irreversible. But victory didn't feel like thunder. It felt like rain. Edward didn't move. For a long moment he sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Then slowly, he rose. "Do you feel powerful now?" he asked, his voice low but carrying. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. He took a step toward me, ignoring the guards who tensed at his movement. "You think this is justice? You think your mother would have wanted this circus?" Her name dragged through every headline, her daughter turned into a spectacle. I met his eyes. She wanted the truth, and truth doesn't hide behind dignity. His mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "You sound like her. I am her." He laughed once harshly. "And look what it cost her." The guards moved closer, but Frederick raised a hand. "Let her answer," he said quietly. I stood, every word measured. It cost her peace. It cost her love. But she died knowing who she was. That's more than I can say for you. The silence that followed was the kind that bends the air. Edward's mask finally cracked. For a second, I saw the man behind the arrogance, the one who'd built an empire out of fear and called it family. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Then he turned, walking out of the chamber without looking back. When the doors closed behind him, it was like the room exhaled. Frederick leaned forward. "You understand the implications of today, Lady Ashbourne. Your name will stand as precedent. The laws around hereditary estates will change because of this." "I didn't do it for the law," I said. "I know," he replied softly. "You did it for her." Outside, the crowd erupted the moment I stepped through the palace gates. Reporters shouted my name. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. "Lady Ashbourne, how does it feel to win? Will you press charges against your father? Are the rumors true about you and Prince Frederick?" I said nothing. The noise swelled around me, but it couldn't touch me anymore. I was walking through a storm, and for once I wasn't the one drowning. Lucian guided me into the waiting car, slamming the door as the reporters surged closer. The world outside became a blur of flashes and voices. "You did it," he said. "No," I said quietly. "We did." We drove in silence for a while, the tension slowly fading into exhaustion. When we reached the edge of the city, I asked him to stop by the river. The Thames moved dark and restless beneath the bridge, the same river my mother used to sketch from when she needed peace. I took the forged letters, the ones the court had returned as evidence, and tossed them into the water. They floated for a moment before sinking, the ink dissolving into black ripples. Lucian watched. "You didn't need to destroy them." "Yes, I did," I said. "Justice belongs in history. Pain belongs in water." He nodded. "And now?" "Now," I said, "turning away from the river, I start living for something other than revenge." Back at the estate, the sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gray. I walked through the gardens alone, past the rosebush labeled Amelia's Hope. The petals had begun to wilt with the season, but they still held their shape. Inside the house, I found the locket again, the one my mother had left me. I opened it, tracing the tiny portrait inside. "It's done," I whispered. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice in the quiet. "Then breathe, Eleanor. You've earned it." I stood at the window until the last of the daylight faded. Tomorrow, the world would call it victory. But tonight, it was silence that felt like the truth. Because justice isn't loud. It just lasts. The headlines had stopped screaming my name. For the first time in months, there were no reporters outside the gates, no cameras flashing through the hedges, no strangers pretending to care about justice for clicks. The silence that followed victory was heavier than the noise that came before it. I woke up every morning expecting a fight and found none. It unnerved me, Lucian said it was normal. "You've been in survival mode for too long," he told me as we walked through the garden. "You don't know how to stand still." "I don't like stillness," I admitted. "You don't have to like it," he said. "You just have to live in it long enough to remember what peace feels like." The Ashbourne estate was quiet now, filled only with the sounds of wind and distant bells. Workers had begun restoring the wings my father had once closed off. They moved slowly, reverently, as if the house itself demanded respect. I spent my days in my mother's library sorting through her old journals. Most were sketches and fabric designs, notes for a collection she'd never finished. But one notebook, leather-bound and cracked at the edges, was different. Inside she'd written thoughts instead of patterns. Fragments of her mind in the years before she died. "People think legacy is what you leave behind," one line read. "But legacy is the part of you that refuses to die, even when they try to bury it." I traced the words with my fingertips. She had known what was coming. That evening, Lucian brought news from London. "Your father resigned from the Ward Foundation Board. He's moving out of the country." "Running or retreating?" I asked. "Does it matter?" he said quietly. "He's finished." I didn't reply. I thought I'd feel triumphant when I heard those words. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. The next day, a letter arrived. No seal, no return address. Just my name, Eleanor, written in my father's uneven handwriting. I carried it to the study before opening it. "Eleanor," it began, "I've lost everything, and maybe that's what I deserved. But before I leave, you should know the truth. Your mother never hated me. She fought me, yes, but not because she wanted power. She wanted protection. From people who would have taken everything from her if I hadn't signed those papers. I was a coward, not a thief. I thought survival was love. I was wrong." The letter ended without apology, just his name, Edward. I sat for a long time reading it over and over, unsure what to feel. He wanted forgiveness, but forgiveness wasn't something I had left to give. I saw his fear in those lines, and the moment his ambition fractured, my need for vengeance fractured with it. The letter wasn't absolution, but it was closure. Still, for the first time, I saw him not as a villain, but as a man who mistook fear for strength. I folded the letter and placed it beside my mother's, binding the two with a ribbon. The past could sit together now, quietly, without clawing at me. I closed my eyes, picturing the girl who had been mocked for cleaning marble floors. That girl had needed rage to survive. But the woman I was now sitting in the rightfully reclaimed Ashbourne study no longer needed the armor of anger. She had won the game not by trading insults, but by using the foundational knowledge acquired during those years of perceived humiliation. His surrender, however hollow, was the final peace treaty for my own soul. 2 days later, I stood on the newly restored steps of the estate and addressed a gathering of architects and heritage students. "Today we launch the Amelia Ashbourne Legacy Fund." I announced the name, ringing clear over the hushed crowd. "This fund is dedicated to ensuring that no talent, no truth, and no legacy is ever dismissed or buried again because of a lack of means or influence." The applause was gentle, purposeful. It was the first time I had used my victory not to tear down, but to deliberately build, and the act felt like a physical release of the tension I had carried for years. Later that night, Prince Frederick called. His voice, usually composed, carried a rare warmth. "I heard about your father. How are you holding up?" "I'm still learning," I said. "Learning what? That peace is heavier than war." He was silent for a moment. "You know, my mother used to say the same thing. Victory is easy. It's what comes after that tests you." She was right. He hesitated. "There's a royal charity dinner next month. They're honoring you for your work with the Restoration Fund. Will you attend?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not sure I belong in those rooms anymore." "Then stand in them until you do," he said. "You earned your place." After the call, I walked through the house, each step echoing softly against the marble floors. Every hallway, every window carried ghosts of conversations I'd once feared. Now the silence felt gentler, like it had made peace with me. In the West Wing, I stopped by the old piano. The dust was gone, the keys polished to their original gleam. I sat and pressed one key, then another, until a melody began to take shape, something familiar faintly echoing the song my mother used to play when I couldn't sleep. As I played, I felt the house listening. Not haunted, alive. Lucian appeared in the doorway, his usual smirk softened by something quieter. "You know," he said, "you're different now." "How so?" "You used to play like you were trying to fight the music. Now it sounds like you're letting it forgive you." I smiled. "Maybe I am." He crossed the room, leaning against the piano. "You're not planning to disappear into this place forever, are you? Maybe just long enough to remember who I was before they told me who to be." We stayed there a while, the two of us wrapped in silence and soft chords. When the night grew late, I went to the balcony. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but out here under the open sky, they seemed far away, like another life entirely. I thought of my father's letter, of my mother's, of the two people who had shaped me through love and loss. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one scrubbing floors, the one no one saw. She was still inside me somewhere, not erased but evolved. For the first time in years, I whispered to her, "You did it." The wind answered softly, brushing my hair across my face. Somewhere inside the house, a clock struck midnight. Not as a warning this time, but as a promise. Tomorrow there would be plans to make foundations, to rebuild charities, to launch quiet ways to honor her name without letting it consume me again. But for now, I stood on that balcony, breathing in the scent of roses carried by the night air. And for the first time, I wasn't preparing for a battle. I was simply alive. A year had passed since the day the crown restored the Ashbourne name. It was spring again, and the world outside the estate bloomed with the same stubborn resilience my mother used to admire. The roses she planted, white pale pink, and one single red bush, were in full bloom now, just as she had planned. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt lived in. The laughter of volunteers and young designers echoed through the halls every morning, filling the air with purpose. The Ashbourne Foundation had become real scholarships for women in design restoration projects across England, mentorship programs. The legacy my mother dreamed of was no longer trapped in memory. It had a pulse. That evening we hosted the first annual Ashbourne Gala in the restored ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glimmered like constellations, music floated softly, and the walls glowed with candlelight. I stood at the balcony overlooking the crowd, people who once whispered my name in scandal, now applauding my work. It still didn't feel entirely real. Lucien approached from behind, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "You should be down there, not hiding up here." "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm watching." He smiled. "You always were a strategist, even when you're supposed to celebrate." I took one of the glasses. "You really think I know how to celebrate? I think you're about to learn." Below us, the orchestra shifted into a familiar waltz, one my mother used to hum under her breath while sketching. The crowd began to turn toward the stage as the master of ceremonies called my name. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and descended the grand staircase. The murmurs quieted as I stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you," I began. My voice carried easily in the room, steadier than I felt. A year ago, this estate was silent, its history buried under lies and dust. Today it stands not because I fought for it, but because so many of you believed a woman's legacy is worth remembering. Applause swelled, but I raised a hand for silence. My mother, Amelia Ashbourne, once said that power and grace can exist in the same breath. That strength doesn't shout, it restores. Tonight isn't about vengeance. It's about rebuilding what was stolen, not through anger, but through creation. For a moment I caught sight of Prince Frederick near the back of the room. He inclined his head, the faintest trace of pride in his eyes. I continued. The Ashbourne Foundation will dedicate its future to giving women the tools to build empires of their own, because true inheritance isn't property, it's a possibility. When I stepped away from the podium, the applause rose again, but this time it wasn't noise, it was warmth, the kind that fills spaces that grief once owned. Later that night, when most of the guests had left, I wandered out to the terrace with a glass of wine. The city lights shimmered on the horizon, reflected faintly in the lake below. Lucian joined me. His tie loosened his smile, tired but content. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I corrected. "You were the one who believed I could stand up to him." He shrugged. "Belief is easy when the truth is obvious." I laughed quietly. "You know, I spent years chasing the idea of revenge. I thought it would taste like victory. Turns out it just tastes like peace." "Peace isn't so bad," he said. "It suits you." For a long while we just stood there in silence, watching the lights ripple on the water. Somewhere the orchestra was packing up their laughter, carrying faintly through the open doors. Frederick appeared a few minutes later, still in his formal coat. "Lady Ashbourne," he said with a grin, "your mother would have been proud tonight." "I hope so," I said. "She would," he replied. "You didn't just reclaim her name. You turned it into something untouchable." He raised his glass. "To legacy." I clinked mine against his. "To freedom." As he left, I looked up at the stars, clear, bright, endless. My mother used to say the stars never stop burning, they just burn quietly once they've found their place. Lucian broke the silence. "You think he'll ever come back, my father?" The question hung heavy in the air. "I don't know," I said. "But if he does, I hope he finds something worth saving in himself." I already did. The night breeze carried the scent of roses. I set my glass down and walked to the edge of the terrace, looking over the gardens one last time. In the moonlight, the marble statue of my mother stood near the fountain, restored, her hands outstretched, holding a spool of thread. Creation and courage use the same hands. I touched the locket in my throat. "It's done," I whispered. "We're home." The sound of applause drifted faintly from inside as the final guests toasted. The music swelled one last time, soft, elegant, alive. I turned back toward the ballroom where laughter and light spilled through the open doors. For once I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside. The crowd turned as I joined them, raising their glasses, faces alight with warmth. Lucienne caught my gaze across the room and nodded once. And for the first time I smiled, not the careful, polite kind, but the kind that comes from a soul finally at rest. I lifted my glass high. "To the future," I said. "To women who build to names they can't erase, and to every silence that finally found its voice." The room erupted in applause, and I let it wash over me, not as noise, but as release. Outside, the night settled gently over Ashbourne. The wind whispered through the roses, carrying her scent across the hills. And as the lights flickered against the glass, I realized something simple, something absolute I had stopped surviving. I was living. And at last, that was enough. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told about strength, truth, and women who rise again, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your story too.